the tangent curve in the interval from 0 to 2 pi. So we're going to use our theta axis here, and we're going to go from 0. We'll mark it out to here. We're going to mark it out to 2 pi. So that's where we're going to end up at. So tangent theta is just the basic. You only have one for your amplitude, your A, and then your B is also going to be 1. So we're going to start to record what we've got here. Our A is 1. Our B is going to be 1, which means my period, I'm just going to use a P. My period is going to be pi over 1, which is just pi. And lastly, the other thing that we need to find with tangent is the asymptotes. So asymptotes are going to be at pi over 2b. So pi over 2 times 1, which is just going to be pi over 2. So asymptotes are at pi over 2 plus your period times n. And don't worry about if you go into this number 4b, because we're not going to be doing that one. So your asymptotes occur at pi over 2 and then at pi times n. And again, that's just coming from our unit circle. So we kind of looked at that right away in number 1, and then number 3 back there. We also saw that your unit circle, you're going to get those undefined measures. I can't find it here. Hold on. Whatever. Sorry about that. Your asymptotes then occur at that top of your unit circle and at the bottom of your unit circle. So that pi over 2 and that 3 pi over 2. All right. So to start graphing this, we're going to start by graphing our asymptote. So we can start setting up the same. So we're going to go from 0 to 2 pi. So we'll mark where pi is, very similar to our sine graph. And then we're going to mark half of pi as pi over 2. Okay, so pi over 2 represents my first asymptote. I'm going to put that in green. Okay. Then we'll start to graph that first curve. I do need to get my unit circle back up. All right. So we are starting by putting 0 in for theta. So tangent of 0, which would be this position right here, is going to be the result of taking the y over the x, 0 over 1. Well, 0 over 1 just gives me 0. That's why when you have seen the graph so far that we've been doing, your first point here is going to be 0, 0. So tangent always is going to start there at that 0, 0. Now we get to the next position. Now, when we started looking at these tangents, this was square root of 3 over 3, this was square root of 3, but this one right here, your tangent at this position at pi over 4 is going to be 1. So when you do the tangent of pi over 4, that's taking the square root of 2 over 2 divided by the square root of 2 over 2, which is just 1. That's a nice input-output to graph. So what you're going to do when you're graphing your tangent, you're still going to mark your amplitude. This would be a 1. This would be a negative 1. And then you're going to go like in between your asymptote and your starting point. Halfway between, that's going to be about pi over 4. And then we're going to graph a point right there. And then you're just going to kind of estimate, you know, what the graph kind of looks like. But that's going to kind of curve towards that asymptote. It's kind of hard for me to do that, but that would be what your first cycle would start to look like. Now we do need to find our next asymptote. So our next asymptote is going to be pi over 2 plus pi. Well, pi would be similar to 2 pi over 2. Make those common denominators. So our next asymptote is going to be 3 pi over 2. Which you go pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3 pi over 2 is going to be right in between pi and 2 pi. So here's where our next asymptote will be. And looking back to your unit circle, that's this position down here. Your tangent is undefined down at that position. Okay, So now we can graph our next asymptote. There it is. And we'll start graphing our curve. And we're just going to repeat. We start at that position right there at pi. Your tangent is going to be 0. We go about halfway in between. We're going to mark where the curve is down here. We go about halfway in between. We're going to mark where that curve is right there. And we start to graph our tangent. It doesn't have to be perfect, but eventually that's going to approach the asymptote there. That's going to approach the asymptote there. Lastly, we're ending at 2 pi. We can only do half of a cycle here, so I'm going to be able to graph down here in this position. And we'll be able to start graphing our half cycle. So our period length was pi. So there are a total of a half cycle, full cycle, half cycle. So there's 2 cycles from 0 to 2 pi, which makes sense. That makes each cycle equal to pi. So tangent is kind of a little bit tricky, and it's just kind of making these curves. Doesn't have to be perfect, but you're always going to graph where your asymptotes are. Once you get your asymptotes set, you can find that position up at this amplitude up here. Starting at 0, 0, make half your curve, get your next cycle ready to go, and you can start to create your tangent curves. So there would be number 4A.